Alright, welcome everybody to another Developer Livecast here on the channel. As always, I am Josh Bycer, and we got a great cast for you tonight. We're going to be catching up with game designer Brian Cronin, who currently works, or is currently working on the game One Last Job at Offscript Games. It is on Kickstarter as we speak, and we're going to catch up with him about the process of designing the game, as well as what he's been doing with the Kickstarter. So, Brian, it's great to have you back on. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me again. I think this is my third time on your cast here.
Again, all these times seem to just fly by whenever we do them.
Yeah, definitely. It has been a while. It's been probably at least a year.
Yeah, again, time seems to fly around here. My YouTube channel is going well. We finally hit over 3,000 subscribers. So I think we
Wow.
must have been like around like 2,000 or 2,500 when we last spoke. So at least
That's great.
things. Yeah,
Congratulations.
thank you. And congratulations on getting to the point of the Kickstarter campaign for One Last Job.
Yeah, it's been a long time going. So we just to give some background on that, we started work on this game. I looked up the email exchange with my co-designer Aki Cabrera, and we started in September of 2015 is when we first met to just talk about the idea of making this card game. Yeah, but that was when we technically first started on it. So it's been a while.
hmm And when we last spoke, you were still, I think, in pre-production at that point. I think, again, it's been at least like 6 months to a year.
Yeah, at that point, I'm trying to remember, exactly where we would have been, but I'm sure we were, the base game was developed, and it was probably a matter of filling out the factions and finding the right cards for all the different decks. So I think that's probably where we were at that point.
Once I'm just turning off Skype there, since we only need draining any additional bandwidth from our calls here. But yeah, it's been a while. Oh, hey, Trayvon, thanks for coming on. Yeah, I know. It's been a very long time to say the least. Hope you're doing well. Trayvon is another podcast guest. He's working on the game Bullock Mayan Warfare. That's also going to be going on Kickstarter. I, unfortunately, it's been so long since we last spoke, Trayvon. I don't remember when your plan is. But I'm sure
Okay.
he'll post it in chat in the next few seconds.
Is that also a tabletop game or is it a video game?
That's going to be a video game.
Oh, okay, great.
But it's great to have both of you guys on tonight. So, with One Last Job, for people who are watching us brand new, whether live or recorded, could you kind of run us through what's the basic idea behind the game?
Yeah, so One Last Job is a two-player asymmetric heist card game. So what that means is two players sit down at the table to play. It's a tabletop game. It's a card game, and you can do deck building ahead of time. So it's like Magic and that Hearthstone, that style of game. But you don't really fight. It's a heist game, so it's more about being sneaky and setting up plans and execution and things like that. And it's asymmetric. So one of the players is the crew. So this would be kind of the Ocean's 11 crew putting together this job. Putting together the heist, getting the right people, getting the right equipment, finding the right time to go on these operations to complete the heist. The other player represents what we call the powers. So the powers that be. And to give you one example, we have three different powers factions in the game. One is the mob. So you can play as the mob, or you can play as a secret society, and or you can play as a megalomaniac, basically a James Bond supervillain. So there's a bunch of different factions, and you both players kind of play the game in a slightly different way. One player is more on the attack, the crew is more on the attack, while the powers is more on a defensive position. So that's kind of the game in a nutshell, I guess. It's very inspired by a game called Netrunner. That's a game that I play a lot competitively and for fun. Just play a lot of Netrunner, and we kind of wanted to take Netrunner and take what's great about Hearthstone and kind of merge these ideas together and see what shakes out. And it sort of took on a life of its own at some point during development.
hmm And I know one of the people who helped look at your game was John Travarius, who currently worked at Duelist, who we finally got a chance to talk to a few months ago. After he left Duelist, I think he's currently working on his own thing now.
Yeah, he recently joined another developer just very recently. But yeah, he's a good friend of mine. met him playing Netrunner, and he contributed a lot to One Last Job in terms of play testing and feedback and general guidance. Really benefited a lot from his feedback.
Mm-hmm. And with One Last Job, in terms of the complexity, I think we talked about this last time, but for the general audience, like, is this game aimed at casual, core, or like expert tabletop players?
I would probably say core, probably middle of the road in terms of that. It's definitely not uber casual. I'd say it's a little more complicated than Hearthstone. Definitely more complicated than, Monopoly or a lot of the classic board games. But it's certainly not expert. We designed it to hopefully be relatively easy to learn, to teach, and to play. So it's somewhere in between. I'm not quite sure where.
Okay. Now, with the idea about being asymmetrical, this is always one of the more interesting challenges, regardless if we're talking about tabletop or general video games. I guess, what was the approach you want in terms of how two players having two completely different experiences with it?
Yeah, so that was definitely central to the game concept. We were not going to make a game that wasn't asymmetric. It had to be asymmetric. I'd worked on a previous asymmetric game, a computer game called Natural Selection 2.
Mm-hmm.
I was a programmer on that project, and I think I greatly appreciated the asymmetry in that game. As well as having played Netrunner, which is an asymmetric game, just saw a lot of great advantages, especially in a card game. It's so fun to be able to kind of like build two separate decks and play the same game in two fundamentally different ways. So that was what motivated us to design this game as asymmetric. In terms of the development, it went in a lot of different directions. It was kind of, the idea was we wanted to capture the feeling of a movie heist in a card game. We knew we wanted it to be asymmetric, and a heist is fundamentally asymmetric. One side is stealing from another, and it's kind of that perfect example of asymmetry. We were also, I think, early on, before I even contacted Aki about this project, I considered a castle defense type of thing, but something about a heist has always appealed to me. So in terms of the asymmetric design, we went back and forth on many different designs. At one point, we had the dynamic completely reversed, where it was actually the crew that was more on defense. They were defending their operatives from being caught by, at that point, I think it was basically the police or the FBI. So the dynamic completely shifted somewhat early on in development. But we started with a completely on its head, the dynamic between the two players. And yeah, iterated on it significantly to arrive at the point it's at. But at this point, it's certainly asymmetric, but not to an extreme degree. So it's kind of a nice balance between asymmetry and a symmetric card game.
Mm-hmm. Now, from looking at the Kickstarter, from when we last spoke, as you said, you have like the crew, which is made up of the different kind of factions, and then you have the powers that be. Is the powers that be, or is there like different like factions of them, or just like one like all-encompassing selection?
So there's a total of 6 factions in the game, 3 per side. So on the crew, you have the professionals. That would be kind of the classic movie heist crew. That is, the Ocean's 11 model of they all have specialties, and we need to get the acrobat and the dynamite person, and that's kind of what they're supposed to be about. They're supposed to be about planning and just perfect execution, efficiency, things like that. And then we have the gangs, the street gangs, and they were heavily inspired by a movie called The Warriors, which I don't know if a lot of people know that movie. A movie from, I think, the 70s. But the idea there is that there's these different street gangs that are coming together to pull off this heist. So in the basic box on the Kickstarter, that would be we have the Cassidy gang, we call them. They're cowboys, basically. So they dress as cowboys. They have a horse. They rob banks as cowboys would, but in a modern setting. The whole game is in a modern setting. And we also have this sort of religious cult called the Flock. So they're about stealing from the rich to support their leader in this quest for glory or what have you. And then the final crew faction is the Freaks. and that would be with a PH freaks. So they're hackers. And that's heavily inspired by the movie Hackers from '96 or something like that. So they're a lot about playing with items. I forgot to mention the gangs are a lot about chaos and disruption, as you might expect, and the freaks are a lot about playing with items and remote control of their heist and not depending on operatives too much, a lot about automation, things like that. And then on the other side of the table with the powers, there's 3 factions, and I briefly mentioned them, but there's the Megalomaniac. This is like a James Bond supervillain. There's the Society, we call them, so it's basically a secret society, and they're a lot about mysticism and sacrifice, things like that. And then the Mob. And the Mob is probably the most aggressive faction in the game, as you might expect. And those are the factions.
Okay. And for folks watching, how many cards, or how many cards are going to come with a standard purchase of One Last Job?
Sure. There's the exact number I can never remember off the top of it, but I know there's something like 120 unique cards in the box, and then all of the player cards, the cards that you'd actually put in your deck, you have 2 copies of each of those cards. So the decks are 30 cards with 2 copies. You could have up to 2 copies in your deck. So you get the full game. There's other decks and cards that come with the game that represent locations, and there's kind of a sort of conflict resolution deck thing in the game as well. That would probably a little bit too much to go into right now, but in total, something like 120 unique cards, and then sort of double that for total cards.
Mm-hmm. I guess in terms of design, it's probably too big of a question. Like we could probably fit like a whole podcast on, but I guess what was like your overall approach to balance between the 2 different factions? Because as you said, asymmetrical gameplay can be very tricky in that front because you're essentially designing 2 different games.
Yeah, in a sense, you definitely have like the core system bringing it together, but then the way that the 2 sides engage with that system is fundamentally different. And so for us, we knew that the dynamic we wanted to create was that the powers are more defensive, and they're not simply defending. We didn't want the game to just be on a timer. There's a good number of attack defense board games, video games that are sort of on a timer, where it's kind of like the defense, they just have to last a certain amount of time. Mm-hmm. So one of the great insights from Netrunner was that you don't need to structure an attack defense game that way. So Netrunner has a slightly different model, and we also borrow from that model in some ways. And that is to force that player to not just defend, but to advance their game on another dimension. So in our game, there's these scenes in the center of the table that are shared. There's just locations that the players play at, move their cards to, and this is where all the action takes place at these scenes. And basically, the 2 players are trying to make the resolution of that scene go in their favor. So if you think of it as a movie scene, a movie scene can go one of 2 ways. It could go in the favor of the mob, or it could go in the favor of the professionals. And that one scene will add up to, the final plot of the whole movie. So we kind of use a lot of movie metaphors here. So the powers have to influence the scene. So they kind of have these little tokens they put on the scene to build up influence at that scene. And there's just a certain number of influence they have to put there, and that's just actions they have in the game. So it does take time to build up the influence, but that is balanced by time that they're not actively defending the scene, because you only have so many actions on your turns. You have to balance between progressing towards your victory condition, which is this influence, and defending the scenes, because the crew is trying to go in there and they're trying to resolve the scene in their favor, which you'll lose all your progress on all your influence if that happens. So I don't know if that explanation makes sense, but that's kind of how the game is structured in terms of asymmetry. And balance-wise, which I believe was your original question, once we arrived at this final system, and we like to say we designed about 5 or 6 different card games along the way, and there was one in particular that we thought was fascinating. It was really interesting and deep, and we'd have these really fascinating games that we'd play against each other, but the games were taking 2 hours to play. So that system was basically too chess-like. It was a lot about thinking down these deep trees to find the right play, and again, it was really like crunchy for us to play and really fun, but it wasn't what we were trying to hit with this game. We wanted this game to be a little bit lighter, more in the 30-minute range. And we had versions where you rolled dice to resolve a conflict, and we had all sorts of different iterations. But once we came to this final system, which took, that took, I think, about a year to arrive at the final system. From there, it was a lot about just tweaking little game rules here and there, the basic balance stuff you'd expect, anywhere from the amount of actions a card takes to how many cards the player gets to keep in their hand at the end of the game. Does the player draw a card at the start of their turn? Things like this, the little tuning knobs you have to eventually arrive at, where we are now.
Now, one thing that's very interesting, what you just said there, Brian, was regarding having the original version of the game be this very complicated affair that could take over 2 hours, and then streamlining it down. I recently spoke with Shane Neville, who's currently working on the game Bunker Punks, which I think is out probably by the time people are watching this.
I think I heard that game came out today or yesterday.
Could be. Just at my own table there. And one of the things that he talked about during that was, again, having an original version of the game being a lot more complicated, a lot more involved, and then kind of streamlining it down to kind of get at like the core gameplay loop, keep that in focus. So with One Last Job, I guess, how was the game, I guess, taking so long, and how did you kind of try to fix that and make it something that is more, bite-sized or easily digestible?
In a short one-word answer would be variance. So I'm trying to remember that specific version of the game that I was referring to earlier. I don't remember all the details, but what I do remember about it is there wasn't enough variance. It was kind of, if you think about a game like chess is such a great example of a game because there's no variance. It's completely, everything's on the table, everything's known, no hidden information, no deck of cards, no dice rolls. It's just one mind against another mind, and you can easily play a chess game for 12 hours long if you want. One of the things that I think people like about card games is there's sort of a fuzziness to it. There is the hand of cards that your opponent doesn't know about. There's the deck of cards that you're going to draw from. Is the top card the card I need? These types of classic questions that make the game fuzzier and make it so that you can use intuition and heuristics to make a decision, which can be faster than having to search a huge tree of possibilities to find the mathematically correct answer. So the version of the game I was referring to that was taking, in some cases 2 hours to play, didn't have enough variance. There was, it was a lot about, even being a card game, you had the random draw, but the conflict resolution we had at the time, I can't remember how that worked. And it won't even make a whole lot of sense to try and explain it because people don't really understand how the game works. But there wasn't enough variance in that conflict resolution. I think that was one of the things that made it, take so long to play. But I wish I had a better answer, but we're really stretching my ability to remember at this point.
That's all right. But yeah, variance is definitely one of the hardest things to do in any video game, especially with something like a tabletop game that you're dealing with essentially a hard-code set of knowns. You have your deck. It's not like the person can, create more cards, when you're done with it. So you have to kind of figure out, within these cards I'm designing, how do I allow or approach multiple solutions or multiple outcomes so that it doesn't devolve, as you said, Brian, like with a game like chess, because everything is known, it's more or less about trying to outplay the other person. So that can, if you have two grandmasters at chess playing, that can take who knows how long of moves. I know your move before I know you before you know me, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you could sit there looking at the board for 45 minutes before you make a play. I think we've all played board games with people like that just sit there and stare at the board for 5-10 minutes and then take a card from a deck that they should have done in their first 2 seconds of looking at the board. It's a balance with board games, especially. because video games can help simplify a lot of that. They can help trim down some of the calculations you have to do. They can help. You kind of want to get to that core decision of like, I'm going to do this or that as quickly as possible. Especially with a board game, you want to get the player into that point as fast as you can, and you want that to be a decision. You don't want one of those two choices to be obviously the best. You maybe want one choice to be the most consistent and the other choice to be a high risk, high reward. That can be a good decision. And you don't want both decisions to essentially be equal. You want there to be a good decision there, and you want to get to the player to that point as quickly as possible.
Now, in terms of actually winning a game of One Last Job, is there any variance in terms of the win conditions, or is there a fixed win for each time you play?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wanted to put in some alternate win conditions, but we ultimately decided not to. So there's just one way to win for both players. It's just there's kind of these cards that we call resolutions, and they have a certain point value on them, and both sides, as I explained before, have a different way to score those resolutions. It's the first player to get 10 points of resolutions. So it's just the single way to win. There's not even like a thing where you deck yourself. That would very rarely happen in this game. Yeah, it's just a basic win condition.
Now, in terms of the actual deck building, correct me if I'm wrong, when we last spoke, did you say that for like the gang side, that they could build their actual deck out of like different factions, or is it like everyone can only pick one faction per game?
Yeah, so the way we have sort of the official rules set up is you always build within your faction, so it'd kind of be Hearthstone style. And then there's a set of neutral cards you can mix in to change things up. That's the basic rule set we have in the rule book. That being said, there's it's a game made out of paper and cardboard, so you can do whatever you want with it. And if people wanted to mix up factions, they certainly could. The game should work fine. We haven't tested extensively with mixing factions up, but you might find some interesting combos we haven't considered. And beyond that, the last thing I would say about deck building is something I'm really interested in is having sort of a seasonal deck building rule. So maybe once a quarter or something, we'll slightly change the default deck building rules. We might say, you can bring in one character from another faction into your deck. That's the deck building rules this month, or whatever. Maybe this month, you can just go wild with the cards and deck build in any way you want. So that's kind of an idea that we're playing with, but mostly that'll depend on what sort of community develops around this game and what people are interested in terms of deck building and playing with other people in their local community, things like that.
And with the various factions again and that kind of thing, for people watching this, I guess what kind of cards make up like the faction? Like, I guess the better way would be like again, in Hearthstone you have the magic card, you have secrets, creatures, right. Warriors get the equipment card, that kind of thing.
Sure, yeah, that's a good question. Like, what different types of cards make up a deck? So it slightly changes between the two sides. The crew have operatives. That's your basic characters. We call them operatives on that side. They're the main point of action in the game. They're the people that move around and do things. You have items that those characters can carry. So those cards, you can equip one item on an operative. Items do a variety of things. They sometimes help defend you. Like, there's a getaway car that will prevent you from kind of triggering an alarm in a way. It'll help you not take on threat, which is just a function in the game. And there's items that are, will help you knock out guards, or items that help you pick locks through doors, all sorts of things like that. And then the last type of card on the crew side is events. And events are just, you kind of pay the action cost and it does something right at that point in time, and then those resolve and go away. So those are the three types of cards on the crew side. The power side is similar with one distinction. They have actors, we call them. Those would be their main characters that move around and do things. They tend to be a little more defensive, in some cases economic. And then there's also events that function in basically the same way. They just do different things. And then finally, they have complications, we call them. And without going into too much detail, those sort of function as traps. You kind of put a complication into the scene, and there's a chance that the crew will run into that complication and have to deal with it. It could be, like a bomb that goes off. It's one of the more exciting ones that comes to mind. One of the more high risk ones that the crew can run into. There's, pressure plates, just a thing the crew steps on and triggers a trap. So just a wide variety of traps. And yeah, that's the different, is 3 different types of cards for each side, basically.
Okay. Now, one thing that I was thinking about, again, as you said, in terms of twisting the knobs, in terms of some of the finer details of balance, like how many cards you draw in a turn, how many actions you can play. As someone who doesn't follow too much in terms of tabletop design, what did that entail in terms of play testing or getting to the point that it felt right for you?
So one good example I could give is the actions, the number of actions a player has on a turn. And the way our actions work are, we arrived at this eventually, but you have 5 actions on a turn, which makes sense. 5 feels like a good number. And you can spend those actions in a variety of ways. One basic way is you could spend an action to draw a card. You can spend an action to move one of your characters to a different location. And then also every card you play has a certain action cost. And so this is kind of like the Hearthstone model, where Hearthstone, they call it mana. They call it mana, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it's so that you start with 1 mana and it goes up until you have 8, 9, 10 mana, something like that. And so that kind of progressively builds in Hearthstone. I don't know that we ever tried that model in particular, but we decided we wanted there to be just a fixed number of actions on a turn, 5, and then you'd spend those actions, they'd go away, and next turn they'd come back. And so 5 is a good number, and the reason for that is that's a good amount of design space to play around with. So we have cards that cost anywhere from 0 to, I think we have 4. I don't think we have 5 actions. I'm trying to remember. I think there were 5 action cards at some point. I'm not sure if there are in the final game off the top of my head. But 0 to 4, essentially, or 5. That gives you a good amount of space to work with. Like there's, due to the math of the game, there's something fundamentally different from 3 and 4 cost. Mm-hmm. Because a 3 cost, character you can put down, you can move it, and you can do a thing all in one turn. A 4 action cost, you put down and you can move it, but then you're out of actions because you've spent 5. So there's a lot of just the number of actions you have on a turn is fundamental to how the game works. And you might want to, as a designer, you might be like, well, 10 is better because there's just more space there. We can do a lot more with 10. You can have cards that cost 7 and 3 and all these numbers in between. Mm-hmm. But that has a lot of downsides too. Taking to extreme, if you have 100, well, now you're designing all these cards and how is a player's going to be left with 13 actions on their turn, and they're not going to know what to do with them, and so there's a certain level of granularity that's too much. Yeah. And alternatively, 2 actions is very much limits what the player can do on a single turn and how much surprise and tension can be created around that. So we experimented with that a little bit, but we generally always tended to be around 5, which is sort of naturally felt right. So I hope that answers your question. It's good to give an example, I think, when I can.
Yeah, and as you just said, Brian, that kind of granularity is a very important detail when it comes to any kind of game built on this kind of heavy abstraction. Because as you said, and I'm sure as anyone who's played or designed tabletop or CCG-based titles go, 1 point can mean a huge difference in terms of what you can and can't do in a turn. I mean, I've seen examples of this from Hearthstone. I'm sure you probably have seen this from examples with Netrunner or some of the other games, that just simply tweaking a card from 5 to 6 or 5 to 4 and can have huge ramifications for everything around it. And one of the things about tabletop games, and as we were talking about earlier in terms of streamlining and trying to make it a little bit more bite size, is the fact that if there's too many things to process in a single turn, that can lead to things kind of becoming locked down. What am I have 15 things I can do, so let me run through each one in my head for the next 5 to 10 minutes and that kind of thing. So keeping things short, but keeping it very simple in terms of streamlining it, I think does go a long way. Just keeping the player from, all of a sudden their brain shutting down from too many thoughts going on.
And that reminds me of, I think, just a great simple mechanic that many card games use, that we certainly use, which is a hand size limit. In our game, it's at the end of your turn, if you have more than 5 cards, you have to discard cards of your choice until you're down to 5. And one of the great things that does, especially in our game where you can just draw cards on your turn, it's not like Magic where you just get 1. You can draw 5 cards on your turn if you want. But to sort of limit that decision space a bit is you give the player a natural sort of penalty of, well, if you draw a card as your last action, it puts you at 6, you're going to have to discard one of your cards, which you can certainly do. It's a choice, but there's just sort of a little hint that maybe drawing a card is not the right thing to do right now. Just little tools like that help the player trim down the decision tree to something manageable.
Now, another thing that I want to ask you, again, regarding that kind of balance, and especially with a deck building game, how does One Last Shop handle kind of the quote-unquote issue of tempo in like a tabletop or any kind of deck building game, which for people who don't know what we're talking about, in Hearthstone, for instance, tempo is that idea that if I do really good on one turn, that's going to carry me through to the next. Like if I end my turn with my side completely full of monsters and you don't have yours, well, that's going to make it a lot harder for you to kind of catch up. And I'm sure everybody here has seen examples of just how powerful tempo can be if the game is designed around it. Now, something like Gwen, that I play a little bit of, that doesn't really have a sense of tempo because each round everybody gets reset. But for you, Brian, for One Last Shot, like, is there a sense of tempo with how the game is played, or is there something else driving kind of the deck building or the card draw?
Yeah, so I would say tempo is definitely a factor. There's cards in the game that sort of function as economic boosts. There's cards that will kind of give you more influence at a faster rate than you can get it by default by just sort of using your actions. There's more efficiency to be gained there, and the crew also has ways to. They have this kind of mechanic called skill, that they have to have skill to get past challenges. And so they have sort of these economic ways to get more skill or to burst out more skill. And so there's definitely tempo involved in that. And you can build a deck and play a deck in such a way where it's kind of about efficiency and tempo plays. That being said, it's extremely important to me that it is always possible for a player to come back and win a game that looks unwinnable. This is absolutely true about Netrunner, and it's true about One Last Job. And it can happen for 2 different ways. But the main thing that allows this to work in One Last Job is the crew always has a chance of just getting lucky. There's this this main mechanic in the game is kind of you put out 5 cards for the crew to choose from, and 1 in 5 is going to be their kind of scoring condition for the resolution, and the other 4 are bad for them. So it's possible for the crew to get extremely lucky, and it's also possible for them to get extremely unlucky. And there's ways that the powers can exploit that variance in a lot of ways. But what I like about that is there's always tension in the game. You can be ahead as either player, and there's always a little bit of tension because they might just get lucky here, or I might get really unlucky in the sequence of events that's about to happen. And that naturally means there's always a little bit of tension, which is important to me. And so I think the answer is that tempo exists, and it's super fun, and it's a part of the game, and it's not everything.
Now, here's another, I guess, general question, like from my own lack of knowledge when it comes to the tabletop genre. With the cards in One Last Job, now obviously you're not going for like a rarity system because, of course, all the cards are in the box at the time. But are there cards that are always going to be like, if I draw this card, it's going to give me a huge advantage no matter what? Or do you go for more like that opportunistic kind of design?
I think there's both. There's cards that are just sort of always good at a baseline level. there's one card that you play and it draws you 3 cards. That's always just going to be a good card. It's not super exciting, but it's always just going to be good. And then there's certainly cards that there's a card called Double Lift that it's a high impact card in that it kind of doubles your chances of scoring a point on that turn in particular. It's very good, but it also has a chance of whiffing, and if it whiffs, it kind of doesn't progress you forward. It doesn't give you more tempo, I think is a good way to put it using your last question. So yeah, there's a wide variety of cards that are sort of utility, just kind of value, and then there's a good number of cards that are more playing into risk reward.
Mm-hmm. And Acid asked a question which I think will kind of be a good lead or segue from what I was about to ask you, Brian. In terms of the actual deck building of One Last Job, what kind of constraints, if any, are there in terms of how someone builds their deck while they're playing? Or before the game starts, I should say.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's Acid Rain, probably. That's a friend of mine. Hey, Acid. So, yeah, the default rules will just be there's factions, you build within the same faction, and then there's neutral cards you can mix in. So there's a good amount of flexibility there. And then, I would really like to eventually print some expansions to this, and there's a lot of opportunity to add new gangs and new items and all sorts of new stuff to help with deck building.
Yeah.
But also people, it's just a game made of paper, and if people want to make up their own deck building rules, they're more than welcome to. I'd like to see their deck lists. I'd like to see what people come up with, and that might influence our decisions on how deck building is really going to shake out as the game evolves over time.
Mm-hmm. I guess to elaborate on my question for a second, Brian, I was also kind of referring to the types of cards. Can someone just fill their deck with nothing but traps or nothing but operatives, stuff like that?
So the only real restriction is you can only have 2 copies of a card in your deck. So you can't have 15 copies of the same card. And the box only comes with 2 copies of each card. So that's the only restriction. Beyond that, you can do whatever you want. It's kind of necessary for the function of the game that, at least for the crew, you need operatives to win the game. It's not a rule, but it's just obvious as you play that that's just how the game works. But beyond that, if you want to, you can in theory, you can build a deck that has, just 2 operatives, and then it's all about putting items on them and playing events. And yeah, there's a lot of different ways to build from there.
Mm-hmm. And I guess keeping with what Acid was saying, what you were just talking about, Brian, games like this, especially the tabletop or collectible genre, they really do open up the doors for a lot of potential in terms of expansions. Now, I forget if I spoke with you or somebody else, but I remember we had a whole conversation about kind of the trouble Magic had in terms of adding in new mechanics or systems. I think it could have been you. I think this could have been our first chat we had, but I guess keeping with that line, in terms of how you see One Last Job, if you are given the opportunity to grow it, how do you see, I guess, mechanic growth, if there is any, in a game like this? Because I know we've spoken to several tabletop designers in the past about kind of that challenge when you start combining, your base game with expansion 1, but then maybe this time up, expansion 1, 3, and 5. But what if I have expansion 2, 4, and 6, stuff like that?
Yeah, so we have something I don't remember the number, but I want to say something like 50 cards basically designed already, that just we decided not to put in this box for various reasons, but that we really like a lot of these cards, and that's just on a different spreadsheet that we don't print but exists. So I guess what I'm hinting at is that there's a huge amount of space to explore with this game still. I have this hacker character in particular that plays with these hacking events that all are named after popular viruses from our world. That's a character I want to explore in the future. There's a lot of the world itself I want to explore. So I think my favorite faction is the street gangs. It's just very fun to play around with these wild characters, and I want to add some more street gangs to the game. I'd like to have maybe inspired by Warriors. There was a baseball team. They're all baseball players. Maybe a sports team or something that joins in on a heist. So yeah, there's just on even the world we've built out. There's a lot of areas I want to explore in that world, and expansions would be a great way to do that.
And continuing with that, as you just said, Brian, with having like additional 50 cards kind of waiting in the wings, how did you decide like what to put into the initial release or the initial retail version of One Last Job?
Yeah, it was tough in some cases. Like going back to the gangs as an example, we kind of had. I think the box comes with. I'm trying to do a count in my head real quick. I think about 3 characters from the 2 different gangs. So within the gangs faction, you have the Cowboys and you have what we call the Flock. So I think each of those has maybe 3 characters from each of those 2 gangs. But I believe we designed out 5 or 6 on each side originally that we would play with. And they had a lot of synergy within each other. Like, the Flock is a lot about movement. They follow their leader is one of the core ideas there. The game has a lot of movement with the cards moving between locations. And so, we had to decide at some point. We were just looking at how many cards we could fit in this box, and we wanted to include a good mix of, we wanted to have roughly the same number of characters as items, as events. We wanted there to be roughly the same number of the different types of cards. So we had to cut some characters at some point that just wouldn't fit in the box. And so, I can't come up with an explicit example off the top of my head of one of those decisions we made. But a lot of times it was a mixture of mechanics and theme. So in some cases, we just felt, this character needs to be in the game because thematically, it's really getting across something about this faction or about this world. We want Kemburn to be in the game because she's the central hacking character. And we also want John Bernard to be in the game, not because he's exciting mechanically, but because he is her brother. And we want the brother-sister dynamic to be there. This might sound silly as a card game that you would have like these characters and whatnot. But as we were developing it out, they became important to us, and we wanted them to be in the game. So there might have been another character within the Freaks faction that was mechanically more interesting, but we just made the decision that we wanted John to be in there because it's important for thematic reasons. So yeah, a lot of different reasons why we decided on the cards we did.
All right. And for folks watching us live right now, in terms of our kind of like schedule for the cast, I probably have another 5 to 10 minutes of questions for Brian regarding the overall design of One Last Job. So if you have any questions regarding how the game works, mechanics, rules, that kind of thing, please get them in now, because we'll move on, like I said, in a few minutes to our second topic. We'll be more or less focusing on the Kickstarter and what's going on that front. But let me see here. Oscar asks, every character starts with different decks. I guess he may, maybe you can fill us in on that one, Brian.
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of different characters in the game, and they exist in factions. So for the crew, you have the professionals. That's kind of like your Ocean's 11, and there's a lot of different characters within the professionals. So that's kind of how it's structured. And so yeah, the box has basically 6 different decks in it, sort of. You take all the cards of a faction and you mix in a certain number of the neutral cards, and then that builds out the deck for that faction. Okay. Yeah, that's kind of the structure of how that works.
Okay. Now, another question that I have for you, and this will probably begin segueing into the Kickstarter in a few minutes, but as you said, One Last Job went through numerous iterations and revisions as you tried to make it more digestible and make it more friendly towards like a core audience. I guess from a design perspective, and even from a playtesting one as well, how did you know when you kind of arrived at that quote-unquote sweet spot of when you're ready to say, okay, we have our core gameplay loop, let's move forward and start, fleshing things out and dialing things in?
Yeah, there was definitely no single point where we decided we have it. That's the easy answer. We never because I think in any game of sufficient complexity, probably even games without sufficient complexity, there's kind of infinite space to explore and
Yeah.
infinite possibilities. There's always the ability to make the game slightly better. And I think we realized, we came to the point where we decided that, you know, we're spending a lot of time to improve the game in very small ways. And that's when we decided it was done. That's when we decided the core system is done. When it was just taking too long to really improve the game much more. And also when, you know, after making changes, we'd kind of be like, I don't know if this is better. It might be, but also it's tough to play the game enough times to really get any sort of data. You have to play with your gut a lot of times. And you just say, is this actually better than what we had a week ago? I'm not sure. It's different. And sometimes new things that are different feel better, but they might not actually be better. They might just be new. So yeah, at some point after playtesting enough, we just sort of decided, you know, let's focus on the cards a little bit more. And if we decide to change the system in the future, that's great, but I don't think we need to. And then that feeling to adjust the core system just sort of tapered off over time. You know, at some point we decided that's done. Like, we're moving forward with this.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about playtesting, I guess, how did like your playtesting sessions kind of go for One Last Shot? I know, again, we've spoken to several developers over this last year about how they kind of operated their sessions, but for you, like, what were you looking for? Did you like have any specific goals or things to look for while you were watching people play One Last Job?
Yeah, I learned a lot about playtesting while working on this game. I'd not even done serious playtesting before working on this game. And so basically, we got really lucky in the sense of, you know, where we live. We're here near San Francisco, just what's called East Bay, just across the bay from San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland. And that area has a really tight community of tabletop designers. There's a group that meets usually once a week, maybe once every couple weeks, meets up at various cafes and locations in the area, and they just play test each other's games and give feedback. And the group is also generally, or at least a few people in particular, are very honest about their feedback. And you just tell me right to my face that, hey, this isn't really working. I'm not having fun. I'm being frustrated by this, and this, which can be hard to take sometimes. And sometimes you feel defensive as a developer. You know, you might have spent dozens of hours on something and maybe it's not working out, and you don't want to hear that. You don't want to believe that. And I see a lot of designers get defensive and justify, and all these things are really bad for playtesting. So we were really lucky to fall into a community that is very supportive and provides a lot of opportunities to do playtesting.
Yeah, and as you said, Brian, I'm sure any developers watching us can also attest to, it is very important to be able to take that feedback and parse it out and do something with it. I know for my fans and all the folks over on the Discord channel, they are more than happy to point out when I mess up or they have any comments and suggestions. I'm sure El Gordo is getting ready to probably type all manner of things onto the Discord chat as we speak.
You know, one thing I learned in particular about playtesting and taking feedback is it's really important to have a notebook and a pen with you. What that signals to your playtester is you care about what they're doing. You care about their feedback. You're taking notes. You're not just sitting there and, like, you know, looking at the ceiling as they play. Because that has the feeling of you're just trying to promote this game or something. Whereas if you have a pen and a notebook, you're looking for feedback, you're taking it seriously, you're there, you're present. That's all very important. A pen and a notebook. I think for video games, whatever, tabletop games, it's important. And the second thing is to try and shut up. Like, you want your players to just play the game. You don't want to over-explain things. If they have a genuine question, they're confused, and they ask you, you should answer. But, you know, you shouldn't try and interrupt them when they're doing something. If they're making a bad play, or if they're misinterpreting the rules a little bit, you should make note of that. And you should later on figure out how to fix it. But, you know, as your job as a developer at that point is just to take the feedback and be objective about it. So those are the two key things I would suggest to any developer of any sort of game that's looking to take feedback from playtesters.
Hmm. How often did you do playtesting, Brian? Like, did you do it like multiple times? Did you do it like one time per like new build or
Right.
new iteration, stuff like that?
Many, many, many times. So, I was fortunate in that he and I were co-designers on this, and we would meet usually multiple times a week and just hang out at a cafe and play the game, over and over again. And we'd write on the cards when there was something we wanted to try, and we'd take notes and change the spreadsheet, and then I'd go back and print out a new print of the game. So we would do a lot of play testing. It's mostly what developing a game like this is just playing it. So we played it a lot, and then in addition, we would often meet with a couple of friends of ours just to share play testing. There was a friend of ours, Keith, is also working on a card game, and we'd meet with him and trade play testing. And then also the main source of play testing of just the widest variety number of people probably came from that group I was referring to, the BAT Dev, it's called, Bay Area Tabletop Developers, on Facebook. So that group, we met with them sometimes once a week to get some feedback from just new people who hadn't seen the game yet. But yeah, hundreds of games played. I was tracking all the games for a while, but then it kind of lost track of it.
Yeah, and we just said there, Brian, regarding having new people look at it as well. That's, of course, another very major thing to keep track of when you're doing playtesting. Because it's very easy to get into that groove of only showing it to people who've spent, hours upon hours playing your game. And then it becomes hard to kind of get that new player's feedback. And that, I think, has been a killer for a lot of indie games where you'll play as a new player and it's like, what the hell am I doing? I have no idea. And it's one of those games where unless you've already spent 10 to 15 hours, you're just not going to figure things out.
Yeah, I think I very much value new player feedback because most of the people that play your game are going to, well, 100% of them are going to be new players at some point. So it's pretty important that the game works for a new player and makes sense. And playtesting will reveal very quickly that your game doesn't make sense to people. And then the hard part is just really figuring out why that is and then figuring out how to fix it, which is not easy at all. But yeah, designing for a new player is core. Yeah. Very important.
And Acid asked a question a few minutes ago, are you still discovering new ways to play after all these play sessions?
This weekend I played a game against my friend Matt, who hadn't played the game, or had played the game, but it had been like a year, maybe. And I realized I hadn't played the game in about a week or maybe even two at that point, and I'd gotten rusty at it. I was making play mistakes, and card games, there's really a lot of space to get better at them. And there's a lot of different ways to build your deck and all of this. So I don't know that I'm in particular all that good at One Last Job right now. I think I was a lot better at it maybe a few months ago. But yeah, I definitely, I know why I lost that game. So that's important. I know why I was using a character in particular I probably shouldn't have been using in that game, considering the way the cards came out on the table, the order they came out and all that. So yeah, you learn something every time you play, which is good. Learning's good.
Of course it is. That's our lesson for today, folks. One quick, I guess, gameplay tangent. In terms of the deck building, what's the actual number of cards that can make up a deck?
So you build the deck with 30 cards.
Okay.
And so at base level, you have 15 unique cards in your deck because you have 2 copies of each card. Now you could have 30 unique cards in your deck if you want. There's no restriction on having to have 2, but you can only have up to 2. There's also some unique characters. So some characters, if they'll just say on the card if it's unique, and that just means you can't have 2 copies of that character in play. So there's some little restrictions there. That doesn't, you might still want 2 copies of that character in your deck because you want it to come up more consistently in the top 10 cards or what have you. But yeah, that's the basic restriction, 30 cards.
Okay. I guess here's my last, general gameplay-related question for you, Brian. And again, for the folks watching us live, this will be last call for any of those kinds of questions before we move on. But keeping in line with the tabletop and kind of the deck building design, one of the things I think is another very interesting challenge of these kinds of games is about going through your entire deck. There are some games where legitimately it's going to be very hard for you to go through 30 cards. Other games, you're going to be lucky if you get through like 20, 25. With One Last Job, like, what's that kind of approach? Like, do you see games where decks will be going through the entirety and then you have to reshuffle? Or is that deck going to last, like, the entire play experience?
So it's very unusual in One Last Job for a player to draw through their whole deck. And part of the reason for that is, you get one card for free at the start of your turn. It just happens, both players. And then from there, if you want more cards, you have to spend actions to draw them. But you use actions to do everything in the game. So if you want to play one of your cards, it takes some number of actions. And so what tends to happen is if you're spending your time drawing your cards, which you can do, but if you're spending all your time drawing your cards, the opponent is building out a board state that's going to beat you before you can draw enough cards to do whatever you want to do. So, yeah, we don't really... I don't know if I've ever seen a player draw all their cards in One Last Job. And it's also because the locations are kind of the central play area of the game. Those are in the center of the table. And if the powers are drawing their cards and not defending those locations, the crew is just going to kind of win very quickly from those locations. You have to basically defend them. And then if the crew is drawing a bunch of cards and not attacking, not trying to steal these resolutions, then the powers is pretty easily they're going to be able to influence the scenes and score them. So yeah, that's kind of why it doesn't tend to happen. Even though you can draw 5 cards in your turn if you want. We had one funny game in playtesting where we had 2 players who are clearly Magic players, and we told them that you can spend your turn drawing cards. And we were very confused at first because they spent their first 3 turns just drawing cards. And then that's when we realized, after the first turn or 2, that we had forgotten to tell them that there's a hand limit. And so they spent their first, they drew like 15 cards each on they were just thinking in terms of card advantage and things like that, if my opponent's drawing cards, I better draw cards. So that was a really funny playtest that they had a huge hand of cards. We didn't even consider a player would do that. Anyway.
Now, one other question that I was just thinking about as you were describing like the general play field, the locations where these scenes take place, are they all kind of assembled like at the start of the game, or do new scenes kind of get drawn over the course of a play?
Yeah, so it basically starts off with just one scene in play. And to give you an example of what these are, we have, there's 3 different sets of locations in the game. There's a casino, which is the mob. The mob owns this casino, and that's where the heist is going down. And the society has a mansion. There's this party going on at the mansion with all the bigwigs and politicians. And then finally, the megalomaniacs are on a train. That's a train heist, and it's about delivering some sort of weapon on a train, and the crew has to board the train. And so all the locations are within those environments. And it always starts off with just one single location. The powers go first, and they have the opportunity to kind of put down some defenses at that location. Then every turn, a new location gets added until there's 3. So there can only be up to 3 locations. And if we didn't limit that, it could be 5, 6, 7 locations, and you're spreading the defenses too thin, and the crew has a big advantage. So 3 locations we found was the right number, where that's a lot for the powers to defend, but it's manageable, and it motivates the powers to score one of the scenes so that they only have 2 to defend. There's a lot of decisions based around the number of locations that are in play.
Okay. So I think with that, and we are just about the hour as well, we'll probably move on and talk more about the Kickstarter and what's been going on more recently. So I guess before we do that, again, if anyone has any final questions, please get them in regarding the gameplay. But for you, Brian, is there anything that we didn't touch on when it comes to either playing One Last Job, the design, playtesting, anything like that you'd like to bring up now?
No, not off the top of my head. I think you always do a good job of preparing questions and asking really interesting questions. So I definitely appreciate answering them.
Well, I just posted a podcast I did with Alexis Kennedy from Cultist Simulator, and over that cast, his light just kept getting lighter and lighter. So look, he was turning into a ghost. So I was hoping I wasn't like killing him with all my tough questions there.
Not too tough. The interesting questions, not tough.
All right. But with that said, let's move on and talk a little bit more about what's going on right now with One Last Job. So, for the folks watching us either live or recorded right now, the One Last Job Kickstarter has officially launched. You guys have been going on for, has been like 3 or 4 days since it actually started?
It's actually been a week as of today.
Okay.
So we brought it up last Tuesday.
All right. So as of right now, you guys have got just over 6,000 to your $40,000 goal. And for those of you watching this recorded, this cash should be going up in the middle of the Kickstarter. So, I guess with that said, for these next bunch of questions for you, Brian, I kind of want to focus more on kind of how you prepare for the Kickstarter, how you set things up, and kind of like what your overall game plan is going to be for the next 32 days. So, to begin with, I guess the first general question that I have is, when it came to the Kickstarter, and this one I always like to ask all of our guests, how long have you, or how long did you spend kind of preparing the campaign before going on?
Yeah. First of all, maybe it'd be helpful if I shared my screen. I don't know if people would be able to see, but if I put up the Kickstarter, would that be useful?
Yeah, sure.
Let me do that. I should be able to do that pretty easily. So I'll just replace my camera. So that should pop up on the screen.
Yeah. Let me put you at full. There you go.
Oh, sure. Yeah. This will probably be good to reference as we go over this. But yeah, so I probably started the Kickstarter page. I probably created it 8 or 9 months ago initially. So, a long time ago that I put this page on my Kickstarter account. Now it started off very basic initially, but over time it kind of functioned as a Google Doc in a way where you just keep adding to it and adjusting it. So there was a lot of iteration, and then within the last a month it really came together. And actually the Saturday before we put it up, so Saturday 2 weeks ago, me and Aki and our friend Velgus, we met at my house and we just finished it up. I finished all the graphics that were needed. There's a little bit more copy to do, last minute details. Was kind of how long it took.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just scroll through this as you're talking.
Okay. I guess one question I kind of forgot, but we can bring up here. In terms of the art, who was the artist who did the various cards, graphics, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So if we have a good, yeah. So here's a piece. So there's like two different types of art here. There's the backs of the cards, and like the layout of the cards is an artist named Sonia. So Sonia did the kind of the graphical layout of these cards, the graphic design, and all that's very important because you're communicating a lot of information with these cards. Let's see if I can pull up a. This might be a good one. Yeah, well, it's not that much bigger, but anyway, there's a lot of information on these cards. There's like the name, the type of card, number of actions, ability, faction, a lot of different information to convey here. And you want to communicate that effectively, especially when this is not kind of the standard creatures attacking creatures type of game. It'd be great just to have the sort of the two numbers that you put on the card that kind of represent the attack and defense, but we weren't making a game like that, so we needed to communicate our ideas in a different way. Yeah, so that was Sonia. And then the art, this card is kind of silly that I brought up, but the art in the middle of the card, a few different people contributed to those. And so the main group that did it is Gong Studios. They're this art illustrate. They do a lot of work. They did work for Fantasy Flight games. They do work for video games. They just they do a really good job. Very easy to work with. I also had my friend Fred work on a few cards, and my friend Aubrey work on a few cards. Who am I forgetting? Oh, this piece was also done by a separate artist. So we have all the different Jen. Yeah, Jen did the piece. But anyway, so yeah, Aubrey Sear, Frederick Terbout, Gong Studios, and Jen Diong.
Okay. And in terms of, as you were just talking about, Brian, in terms of getting like the actual look of the cards down, I guess what was, I guess, the most interesting or unique challenge you ran into in terms of kind of conveying that information to somebody?
Yeah, let me come up with an example. Let me just find a card that uses this is this is good. So I guess it's worth me pointing out at some point here that we don't have all the artwork completed. Well, it kind of depends on how funding shakes out. So this is an example of a complication here. And we want to fill in the center here with a cool piece of art. This is supposed to kind of be a bomb, and I want to put a bomb in the center, but it just sort of depends how funding works out. But to answer your question, this piece at the bottom here was the most difficult to figure out how to represent on the card. I don't know that it's perfect, but it's pretty good. And what this represents here is just, it's kind of saying when the crew discovers this card, it's attached to the scene. So it's at the scene where they discover it.
Brian, I don't want to interrupt you too much, but it's a little hard to read the text. Would you be able to zoom in like a little bit, or is that not possible?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, so I'm not trying to go into this too mechanically, but just to create an idea of what's going on here. So it kind of just is, it's a bomb at the scene, and here's what happens is it just says at the end of the turn, trash all operatives here, and then trash ticking noise. So the bomb goes off, and it'll blow up all the operatives that are there. That's all of the crew's people that are at that scene will get trashed because the bomb goes off, and that's bad. So they have a few ways to deal with this. They can just move out of the scene, but they might not have enough actions left on their turn to get everyone out of there. In addition, they can defuse the bomb, and that's what these two little symbols here.
Yeah.
Let me zoom in some more. So this iconography was difficult to convey and figure out, but what this is supposed to be indicating here is they could spend 2 of their skill to prevent this sort of effect from happening. Okay. So they can save their operatives by using these lock skills. Is kind of what this is saying.
Okay. And does like the little like gun or like little ray gun to the bottom right, does that signify anything, or is that just for like the kind of card it is?
Yeah, this represents that it's part of the Megalomaniac faction. Yeah, this is one of them. The Megalomaniac is a lot about having these crazy traps and whatnot. So, yeah, that's just a faction indicator.
Okay. All right. Yeah, and again, like this is stuff that is universal beyond just tabletop games and video games as well, would be able to convey important information as simply and as cleanly as possible. Because, again, like, especially with a game, with a tabletop or a card-based game, you don't have a huge amount of real estate to show all that information. And I'm sure you must have gone through several different iterations of trying to get, what kind of symbols to use, what kind of colors, things like that.
Yeah, and it's a very confusing mechanic until you understand it, because you can just read the text, and the text just says to do something, and you're like, oh, I should just do that. But we're trying to indicate you do this unless if you spend these resources to stop this thing from happening. And so this is the final iconography we arrived at. And this is definitely by far the best version of this iconography we came up with. And it works. It's pretty effective.
Mm-hmm. Now, going back to the Kickstarter itself, as you said, you were kind of working on this for about a year, and then you kind of began like final touches about 2 weeks ago. I guess in between there, and this is another one of those questions I like to ask all of our developers, how did you determine that One Last Job was ready to go to Kickstarter? Because as you said, earlier you said you had 50 cards kind of like on a separate spreadsheet that could be saved for expansions or could be added at another time. So what kind of led to the game going on Kickstarter now, as opposed to, waiting a month, 2 months, whatever?
Yeah, so, we were getting to the point where towards the start of the year, we were kind of saying, we're ready to go on Kickstarter. We want to make this happen. And then there was just a lot of details to work out. So to give you some insight, it was things like pricing. We needed to verify our budget. We needed to make sure that we knew how much this game was going to take to produce and it was going to take to ship, and that we had an art budget. And, there's a lot of just money things we needed to figure out. This is a physical product we're printing.
Oh, yes.
We need to make sure we have a budget, we fall into it, because that stuff's not flexible. we also needed to make sure I wanted to have reviews lined up, which really worked out. We had so about this must have been 2 or even 3 months ago, no longer than that, about 4 months ago, I started reaching out to reviewers and said, hey, we have this game. It's a heist card game. This is what it's about. I'm going to send out review copies soon. Does anybody want to review it? And we had 4 different reviewers step up. A couple here on the page that got in time. Geek City USA, Everything Board Game. So they reviewed it. And so I had to get the game put together in a way where I could send it to them and get it to them in time so that they had time to review it before our page went live. So there was a lot of just logistics to figure out there. And then once all of that was in order, so we had a budget figured out, we had reviewers that were working on the game, that's when we decided, we're ready to go. So we decided on a date at that point. We're just looking at the calendar. We were trying to figure out if there's any dates that would be bad, how it would fit in just to, our schedule of our lives and when the campaign's going to start and end and when we're available and all that kind of stuff. So we eventually found a good date. And then at that point, we, really pushed for it and got it all put together by that time. There was also a couple videos we put together that we started putting together, I think, towards the start of the year and got together before, the campaign went up.
Mm-hmm. And what you said a few minutes ago regarding kind of managing the budget, knowing how much you were going to ask for, that's always one of the more challenging aspects of Kickstarters, and especially just in general with indie game development, when it comes to new developers, because you may not have that background when it comes to budget or project management. I guess for you, Brian, were there any aspects of planning the Kickstarter that kind of like threw you for a loop, or that you weren't, or that you kind of had trouble with doing, like kind of as your first Kickstarter?
I'd say it was all pretty challenging. I've worked on many games, but I'm not very good at selling games. I've not done that too many times. I've only done that really technically once before. And it's not a skill set I have. I had to learn how to do that, and I don't think I've done it quite effectively, but I've put together a decent campaign, or we've put together a decent campaign, I should say. So I'd say all of it was a learning process. I did a lot of reading. I read a book about board game Kickstarter campaigns and what to do. I put together a lot of different Google Docs and spreadsheets, as I tend to do, get just over organized. If anything, I probably spent a little bit too much time on it. Maybe I should have put it out sooner than I did in hindsight. But, wanted to make sure everything was put together in the right way, and that especially the numbers, we wanted to make sure that we had the budget figured out, because there's a lot of horror stories of campaigns not asking for enough or asking for too much or whatever. So, yeah, I think there was no single thing that was too challenging. The video was actually pretty challenging. It took a lot of time to put together. I put together a whole storyboard for it and had to figure out the sort of plot of the video and how to frame it. And I'm using the word I a lot here, but there was a lot of help, of course, from Aki and from our friend Velgus that helped along a lot of these processes. But the video was pretty difficult to eventually get put together. We had somebody we hired to edit together the final video and make it happen, which helped a lot.
Mm-hmm. And looking at the Kickstarter, I guess one thing that and this is probably going to also lead back to what you're saying regarding the budget, is coming up with like the actual like pricing for the game, because pricing when it comes to any kind of game is, a podcast in of itself for a lot of people to try and figure things out. Now, for people watching us who haven't gone to the Kickstarter yet, you have a price right now, or the reward is set at $37 to basically get the copy right there. Is that going to be the actual planned price for One Last Job if it does get its backing, or would it be more money like in a retail setting?
In a retail setting, I'm not exactly sure how that would shake out. We've not talked to retailers yet, and that's sort of a problem for future Brian, future Aki to figure out. But yeah, arriving at that number was interesting. We kind of we knew we needed, like $40,000 to make this happen. Just when all the numbers are added together, you usually can't print on demand. You need to, you have a minimum order you need to print.
Yeah.
which depending how you go is somewhere on the order of 1,000 or 1,500 units, boxes you need to print. So when we did all of our math, we had a spreadsheet to try and calculate all the tax and shipping and all the different factors that add into it, the Kickstarter fee, all these little details that we worked hard to make sure we had right. We discovered that there's a little bit of wiggle room. Like we could have gone for 35, to be honest, and we were originally looking at 40, and I really wanted it to keep it under 40. And the reason we didn't go for 35 is actually significant, is that the final, I say we couldn't have done 34. We could have done 35 just because the math at the end worked out to like $4 or something. That would basically be like we'd make $4 profit if we went for $35 a unit and it funded fully. That's what we would come out with. And we're not even really planning to make a profit here, but that was just a little bit too tight, a little bit too close, where I'm kind of thinking, boy, if we have one of these numbers slightly off, that could be disastrous.
Oh, yeah. And
the margin was too close. So we talked a lot about, should it be 35 or 40? What should we do? And I sort of joked. I was like, what about 37? That's like in between. Why not that? And a couple weeks after having a discussion, we decided, we're like, I was kind of arguing for 35. Aki was arguing for 40. We were talking a lot about it. And at some point I was like, I bet it's 37. We're talking a lot about this and we're not sure which is right. It's probably somewhere in between. Let's go for 37. And that's just sort of what we went for. And this means we have a little bit more, not a huge margin. We have a little bit more of a margin in the case of like barely funding. We should have a little bit of a buffer space if something comes up. And it also means that we should be able to produce a little bit more artwork with just a little bit more funds.
Yeah, and as I was saying, I've heard, I'm sure you've heard as well, and the folks watching, all manner of horror stories of Kickstarters that kind of undersold what they're asking for. And then, as you said, just like one little hiccup can happen, and now you're over budget and you can't finish the game.
You'd be surprised how expensive cards are to print as well. I mean, the manufacturing is not astronomical. And I should mention, this priced at 37, that includes shipping within the United States as well. So, if you ignore shipping, it would be more like 27. But
yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the kind of the physicality of the release as well, or the manufacturing and the shipping. I've spoken several times in the past to developers who've done either card games or tabletops about kind of those additional hurdles when it comes to the fact that you are releasing a physical product. It's something that actually exists in the real world. It's not one of those crazy digital games that all of us watching.
This has a weight to it. This is a real thing that will take up space.
Gravity impacts it too. It's amazing.
Has to be on a boat for like 2 weeks.
And actually, Mike just asked, is it being printed in the United States, or I'm assuming you have an overseas manufacturer?
Yeah, we have a few different options in terms of manufacturing, but they're all in China. I think there are some ways to print in Europe or in, I don't know where else, but the vast majority of board games, tabletop games, happen in China. Just the costing is really difficult to make work. I would love to print it in the United States, but the game would be, people would think I was ripping them off. And so it's kind of an unfortunate situation, but that's kind of the way the economics are right now.
Mm-hmm. And speaking about the different manufacturers in China, this may be a little bit of a tangent, but how did you decide like who to go for? And you don't have to get into details of contract negotiations or things like that. But for anybody like watching this right now who's doing like tabletop or card game publishing in the future, like what were some like key things you were looking for out of the manufacturer? Like kind of things people can take notes on if they're playing their own thing.
Yeah, so generally the process, just working with the manufacturers, has been to send them the specifications of your game, and some of them have more sophisticated ways to take this information, but it's going to be things like, how many sheets do you need printed? The cards come on big sheets. And how many sheets do you need? And how many punch boards do you need for tokens? How many dice do you need? All that kind of stuff. And then they give you a quote, and they just say, here's how much it's going to cost to produce 1,000 boxes, 2,000, and economies of scale kick in. So if you produce 10,000 boxes, it's way cheaper, significantly cheaper per box to produce. So they give you that breakdown, and then they tell you this quote is valid for maybe 6 months. So there's not, you don't actually sign a contract with them. You just kind of, you send them the details, get a quote, and that quote is valid for a certain amount of time. And that's the process. And then after you have your budget and you have your money, you sign a contract with whoever you go with. And in terms of figuring, so we haven't committed to anyone yet. We have a few different options, and they're sort of like, there's the manufacturer I want to go with because I think they're going to be the easiest to work with if we have the budget to, for their quote. And then there's some cheaper manufacturers we could go with that I think will produce the same quality, but might just be a little bit more challenging to work with, language-wise or whatever. So yeah, we haven't fully decided yet, but we have quotes from, I think, 5 different manufacturers, something like that. So we have a lot of options, and there's also options in terms of the different types of tokens we have available to us and all sorts of. Some of that's built into the stretch goal. We have some wooden tokens on the higher end of the spectrum. Yeah, and in terms of finding those manufacturers, a lot of it was either recommendations from people I talked to who produce Kickstarters. In particular, Tim Fowler was very helpful. He produces this game called Burgle Bros, is a heist game, which is how I got to know him, and a few other games that are quite popular. So he spent the time. I spoke to him for about an hour on Skype at one point. And he gave me some suggestions, and Jamie Stegmeyer was another person I haven't spoke to personally, but has posted a lot about Kickstarter and manufacturers. So I read a lot of Jamie's writings on the topic as well.
And I'm pretty sure I've asked this question before in the past, but just to clarify for folks new watching us either live or recorded, when you deal with a manufacturer and they do things, does one manufacturer kind of handle all aspects of the producing of the materials, or is there one manufacturer that does handle cards and another manufacturer that handles figurines and so on and so forth?
For our game, it's going to be a single manufacturer because our game is relatively simple. It's cards and cardboard tokens and a rule book, a box, basics. And for a lot of manufacturers, are one-stop shop as far as I know. You go there, they have all the different tokens and components you might need for your game. But if you get into things like miniature games in particular, if you have very specialized components in your game, in some cases, either that manufacturer will subcontract some of that work out, or you'll have to work with a different manufacturer on your resin models or whatever and get those shipped over to the manufacturer, the original model. So generally, though, it seems to be a one-stop shop.
Okay. And Mike beat me to the punch for this next question. In terms of actually publishing the game and distributing it, that kind of thing, are you guys handling that all on yourselves, or are you going to go to a third party that will handle kind of distributing it out?
We're using a fulfillment center. This is very much like manufacturing, where we've gotten quotes and rough price estimates of what shipping and fulfillment will look like. And so there's a few different, I learned a lot about shipping throughout researching this. There's the shipping generally refers to taking the boxes from China to a warehouse somewhere. So there'll be, a pallet or a few pallets maybe that come to the United States, some that go to Europe, some that go to, Canada, whatever. And they'll go to these fulfillment centers, which are basically warehouses, and people work there, and they, in some board games you might get on a Kickstarter that has a board game and 2 expansions and a dice pack, and they take all of those components that based on your stretch goals and whatever reward you chose, and they put them all in a box with your address and send it to you. So we're going to use probably a few different fulfillment centers. I have a few that are researched that will, we'll ship them the boxes from China, and they'll pack them all up and send them to the right people based on a spreadsheet we send them, and that's basically the process. So I don't have to store them at my house, and I don't have to do all that work to actually fulfill all the shipments. And also it's very expensive to ship things directly from my house in Berkeley, California, versus sending a huge pallet over to Europe and letting people there ship it to the domestic areas.
Oh yeah, I'm sure there are plenty of horror stories about doing all that shipping yourself. And I think I've spoken to several tabletop developers in the past who got all that stuff sent to them, so they have just a garage full of their game that they have to ship out.
Yeah, that seems like a lot of work for no real benefit. Um, even like I'm in the United States, I could probably do that, and but fulfillment isn't that expensive, and it saves you a huge amount of time, and
Yeah.
also they're probably going to do a better job of it than you would, and I don't have a big house, so it's just not even possible for me.
Yes. Taking this back to the Kickstarter, then, I want to talk about the stretch goals in a few minutes. But in terms of like the actual, like just like the general design of your Kickstarter page, I notice that you don't have a lot of goals, or I'm sorry, not a lot of goals, a lot of rewards. And this is not
Mhm.
one of those very interesting and probably multifaceted topics, depending on who you talk to when it comes to Kickstarter planning. I guess, how did you settle on what you wanted your rewards to be? Like I'm sure you must have had came up with other ideas, but how did you settle on those three?
Yeah, so we kind of, I don't know. I had this theory that you either sell your game on Kickstarter on the game itself, or you sell it on rewards and expansions and stretch goals and all this kind of stuff. And both are valid. And in truth, there's probably a good mixture for any game on a Kickstarter. It's neither one or the other. But so I kind of decided that, or we decided that we were gonna just try and sell it more on the game concept itself. This is our first time doing a Kickstarter and first time producing a tabletop game, so I didn't want to get overly complicated with it. It was hard enough just to put the game together. It was probably even more difficult to put the Kickstarter together, and so I wanted to try and keep things simple for our initial game. And so we invested more of our time into putting this page together, trying to explain how the game works, producing videos that we felt would be helpful to explain the game and sell the game. And so we didn't put as much time or effort into the actual reward. So the reward is pretty basic. The basic one is just you get a copy of the game with all these stretch goals. There's not even that many stretch goals. So that was the theory behind it, is sort of just we didn't want to overinvest in figuring out all these rewards, and kind of a belief that if people see a game that they're into, if someone's like really into card games and heist movies, that this will appeal to them on that level more so than it would if we included a dozen different rewards. That we would just get more bang for our buck with the approach we took.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the idea. I don't know if that's true. That is a bit of a gamble, I guess, either way, but that's kind of what we decided.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, again, depending upon who you talk to and the scope of the game itself, can have major ramifications for how you plan your Kickstarter out. When I spoke with, I forget his name, Sandy Pearson's son, who was part of the marketing for Cthulhu Wars, I spoke with him and Ed Healy, who did like their kind of press side, and they talked about all the different like little plans and aspects of how they scoped out the rewards and the stretch goals and all that. And they had like an extensive list of things, all manner of things they could add to it. But again, it really depends on what you're really focusing on for your game. Now, with the stretch goals themselves, for people watching, if you're watching this live record right now, you have 50,000, 60, 80, 100,000, 120, and then 160. In terms of kind of setting up the stretch goals, because I know this is another thing that could fill its own podcast, what was your approach to kind of like which ones to price first, what order, that kind of thing?
Right. So the initial ones are just more artwork. So this was just very important to us. We wanted to, the game really will pop out and become alive when all the artwork is in there, and we have a vision for how we want the game to look, and we, some of these characters are very much alive in our minds, and we want to bring out through the artwork. So those were the first stretch goals. The initial one, 50,000 for locations, is because there's not that many locations. There's 30 locations in the game. We actually have artwork for 10 of them already, so we just need to produce 20 more location artworks. So the economics worked out there. And then 60,000 is for every single player card in the game to have custom artwork. That's just how the math worked out. Again, it was that at 60,000, the art budget was big enough to give us the bare minimum we needed to produce all the pieces of art. And we know how much art costs because we produced about 13 or 14 pieces of art, well, more than that technically, while making this campaign. So we know the art budget that we need to really do justice to this. And then from there, we decided to focus on kind of new gameplay things. So we're going to add a new card to each faction. We haven't even fully planned out what that'll be yet. Partly, I want people in that campaign to inspire that. Like, I'm hoping that we can work with the community that develops here to figure out what sort of cards, what sort of characters they'd like to see in this game, and then we'll make it happen. And we wanted to do this kind of off the wall heist, so we wanted to do something just very wacky. Again, we haven't fully decided what that's going to be yet. It's going to be based on feedback from people, but it's going to be something probably pretty silly and something that shouldn't be in the game probably, but we're going to do it because it'll be fun. And then we wanted to upgrade the tokens. So when we have enough money to do that, we can create really cool wooden tokens rather than just sort of the cardboard punch out.
Mm-hmm. And now here's a question that always elicits very interesting responses from developers when we talk about Kickstarter. Was there any plans that have Kickstarter exclusive rewards or content, or did you just write that off right from the beginning?
Yeah, this is where, probably I'm not as good a marketer, where I decided that sort of sucks. So as someone who has backed a good number of Kickstarters and who buys a good number of games, maybe it's just I'm getting older, but I was kind of like, that just seems like a lot of effort and confusion. And I kind of just want to buy a game and know that, oh, this is the game and I can play it. And that's kind of that, So we decided not to do anything like that. Again, probably a bad marketing decision, but we just decided it wasn't for us. It wasn't the type of game we were making. Also it's intended to be kind of this competitive card game. And so to some extent, having exclusive content would not be fair. And we wanted the game to feel like it's a game that's fair, that, you're going to buy the box. It's just a single box you need to buy. You have everything you need to play the game and you play it, and you compete on your own sort of skill level rather than what you own. That was kind of important to us. So all of that informed the decision. We also decided not to. Some campaigns have an early bird thing where like the first 100 people get a slight discount. We decided not to do that. It might be effective, but we didn't want people coming into the campaign late to feel like they missed out on something. And it also screws with the math a little bit. And again, the math was already complicated for me, so I decided to try and keep it simple. So yeah, those are sort of the justifications for that, I suppose.
All right. And as a quick time check, we are now at about an hour and a half in. I figure we'll probably begin to wrap things up in the next 10 to 15 minutes, unless anything else pops up.
Sounds good.
For any folks watching this right now, this will be last warning. If you have any questions regarding the Kickstarter, so I have one last job. So please get them in now if you are watching us live. But for myself, and as you said there's that challenge. I think there's something that preconception. I know I'm the same way, that when I buy a game, I want to make sure that I'm buying everything in that game. I mean, I've played Kickstarters as well, or I've played Kickstarter back games, that it does hurt when it's like, you bought the game, but all this stuff over here, it was available for a Kickstarter that you never heard of, which you can't pledge to, and you can't get it anymore. Good tough luck there. And it can hurt for a lot of people when you're locking that stuff out. So I'm definitely in the same way when it comes to having that kind of Kickstarter exclusive stuff. Now,
I think one way to think of it is just, if all that stuff could be in the single box you buy, you'd prefer if that was the case. If it would be more expensive that way, you'd prefer that it's just sort of an optional expansion you can buy later. That's kind of just what you'd want. So if that's not the case, then I think there's marketing happening, which is undoubtedly effective. And I'm not necessarily judging that marketing, but it is marketing. Maybe this is just where I'm not a good marketer. When something just doesn't feel right to me, it's hard for me to justify doing it. And that might be a flaw, but that's kind of how I felt.
But I guess continuing with that in terms of fleshing out the Kickstarter and things along that line, Was there any aspects of, I guess, plying things out or scoping out the Kickstarter that prove that kind of like threw you for a loop? Like for any developers watching us right now, was there any particular part of the Kickstarter that you have any advice for because it was a little bit vexing or a little bit extra challenging for you?
Um, for me, like figuring out the budget took a lot of time. Um, Also, I'd say in hindsight, it probably would have we took a lot of time to write all the campaign text up and make sure we were wording things just right. We did a lot of back and forth on that. In hindsight, it probably would have been better for one of us on the team just to take it on and do it and not necessarily look for a ton of nuanced feedback. I don't know how important it is that we worded all these paragraphs just right and just the way we did. It's probably not super important, but we spent a good amount of time trying to get the wording just right. So I probably would have not worried about the language itself so much. I was happy that we paid someone to do the video. I think that was definitely worth the money, and the time savings definitely worked out. I'm just throwing out random things as I'm looking at the page right now. Yeah, I did a good amount of the graphics on the page, which worked out well. We kept it pretty simple. They could have been a lot cooler, but I'm not a graphic designer. But they worked out okay, all things considered. Yeah, I'd say that the sort of like budgeting and figuring out all the costing was a challenge and is important to do. And if people had questions about that, I would be more than happy if they reached out to me to try and answer them as best as I can, because it would be hard to go over all that right now.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, were there any aspects or plans for the Kickstarter as like additional videos, features, or other special promotions that you kind of thought of but decided against doing it?
Not really. There's some things I still want to do and just need to figure out, just need to carve the time out to make them happen. Like, I'm thinking I want to do some updates on the campaign page that are structured sort of as a heist. I want to encourage people to share the game with their friends. And so I kind of have this vague idea of structuring throughout the week, given some updates that are structuring this sort of mission to spread word about the game. And it's very vague in my mind, but there's sort of blueprints in my mind of how to make it happen. So I think there's still things I want to do on the page and on the campaign. Mm-hmm. But generally, I'm pretty happy with how it came out. There certainly, we could have made it a lot better, but it would have taken a lot more time, and we decided we needed to kind of put this up and make this happen.
Mm-hmm. And as a general tip, and one that I've learned from watching a lot of Kickstarters and talking to people, it's definitely very important to keep your Kickstarter page updated. Having daily posts, daily updates, stuff like that. Because one thing that can easily kill a campaign I've seen is when the person is very active for like the first week, and then they disappear at all. And I've spoken to many developers about this, but when you're running the Kickstarter, it kind of becomes its own job for however long your campaign is.
Yeah, I need to. I mean, I need to get another update out. I'm going to put an update out tomorrow morning. I've been slowly, something I told myself I wanted to do before the campaign went up is I wanted to thank everyone personally. So I've been writing messages to everyone who backs the campaign and trying to write something to every person individually. So I've done that for about 50 people, but I still have another 50 or 60 I need to catch up on. I spent like 4 or 5 hours last week just sending out press releases. We're going to try advertising this week. So there's infinite work to do on this. And it's just a matter of trying to fit this into an already full schedule and a full-time job and all that kind of stuff, and trying to make this work.
Mm-hmm. But I think I am just about out of questions. So I will throw it to you, Brian, and then to the folks watching. Are there any aspects of the Kickstarter side of things that we didn't touch on that you'd like to bring up now?
The only thing that comes to mind is, just say for this game in particular, if this game looks cool to you, of course you're welcome to back it, and that's very appreciated. But if you have a gaming community you're a part of that you think would be interested in a heist card game, I would love if you'd be willing to share it with them. If something gets posted somewhere, please send it to me on my Twitter. I guess you'll probably post in the comments, maybe, Josh. Yeah, that's the easiest way to get a hold of me. But I'd love to hear from you if you post it somewhere. If there's comments, I'd love to get feedback on it. I've been working on this game for over 2 years and just want to engage with people on it and see what people think.
Mm-hmm. And I just posted a link to the Kickstarter in the comments or in the chat box there for people watching live. There should be a link to it in the description below if you're watching this recorded as well.
Excellent. Thank you.
But I think that is about it from me. I'm trying to quickly go through my mind here. If there's anything left to ask or anything just pops up.
Sure. No, I know it's getting late for you over there. I know. So
I know, and I have to do a game stream after this too. So I'm going. My brain's going to be fragile for sure. There we go. I guess here's one general question. This could probably fit with the first section, but I think it does serve an important question because I saw a Kickstarter backer left this for you as well. Was there any point where you thought about changing the number of players who could play One Last Job? Someone was asking about if there was ever the possibility of doing like a single player version. Could you have done, a 4-person play, a 3-person, stuff like that?
We never really, I wouldn't say we didn't consider it, but we very intentionally decided to keep it a 2-player game. So we never explored a single player or a multiplayer variant. It was always about the core 2-player experience. It's about a heist, and there's 2 parties involved in that heist, and that was always the focus.
Mm-hmm. And okay, I guess here's my last question, because I think this is one that we kind of talked about earlier, but I think it's a great one to bring up here. And that has to do with, again, expanding on One Last Job. As you said earlier, and as you also posted on with like the Kickstarter pitch, if the game does succeed, there's certainly room to open up the door for more expansions and more content like that. Were there any systems or new game options that were kind of in the back of your mind that you decided not to include in this initial release?
No, there really weren't. I mean, we've been on this final system for almost a year. That we've kind of had the finalized system and just been tweaking cards and effects and whatnot. There was versions of the game before that had all sorts of different features that aren't included in this version, but we never really had I guess design stretch goals or things. Everything that we wanted to include the game, we put in the game. There's certainly cards that are not in there, but in terms of the core system itself and what we wanted to express there, there was one. Okay, this is a good example. There was a version of the game that had this kind of alarm system that would alert the powers. At that point, it was like the police to activities going on. It was sort of an interesting alarm system. It was in the game for a long time, and eventually it sort of just dissolved away out of the game. And we never put the alarm system back in. I don't think that this version of the game would benefit from having the alarm system, and there's sort of a new system that's taken over called Threat. But it was an interesting thing involving movement and traps, and there was something cool about it, about that idea. It just doesn't really fit into this game in particular.
All right. Well, I think with that, again, it is getting late here for me. I guess, what time is it where you're at? I think, are you like 3 hours behind me or 2?
Yeah, almost 9 p.m. right now.
Okay. Yeah, so it is getting close to midnight around here. So I think we will begin to I think it's time to wrap things up here. Brian, again, it's been a pleasure hanging out with you. Hopefully, we won't have to wait so long for our next talk. And I gave Brian an invite to our Discord channel, so I'm sure we'll be able to chat there as well. And for any folks who would like to join us and like to talk about game design industry topics, you'll find a link to that in the description below. But other than that, it's been great hanging out with you, and definitely the best of luck for One Last Job. Like we said at the start, as of the time of our stream right now, you have 32 days left in the campaign. There'll probably be less for those of you watching this recorded. But be sure to check it out. I guess to end the cast on a high note, Brian, do you have any final thoughts or anything you'd like to say to the fans watching?
First of all, just thanks for having me on again, and I always appreciate talking to you, Josh. You're very easy to talk to, and I appreciate the questions and the way you structure these interviews. So I'm always happy to come on and chat, and maybe next time I come on, we can just talk about video games. Finally, I play a lot of video games too. Slay the Spire in particular recently.
Oh yes, oh yeah, that could be a good 2 hours, I think, between the two of us right there talking about that game.
Yeah, absolutely. But no, I appreciate it, and thanks everyone for the great questions and for watching, and yeah, working on this campaign more, make this happen.
Nice. And for people watching us right now, since we last spoke, I finally joined the smartphone crowd. So I can actually record now outside of my computer. So I could actually look at tabletop games going forward for any developers watching us either live or recorded. So if you'd like me to take a look at your game, whether it's a tabletop, video game, smartphone, anything like that, please don't hesitate to get in touch. But again, be sure to check out Brian's Kickstarter for One Last Job. You'll find the link to that as well in the description. But for you folks watching this live right now, I will be back for our game stream probably in the next 15 to 20 minutes. If you're watching this record and would like to get access to this cast earlier and ad-free, be sure to check out patreon.com/GWBycer. Any VIP supports get those early access videos. And for you, Brian, for people watching, if you wouldn't mind, what's your Twitter again if they want to follow you?
So I'm just at Brian G. Cronin. So it's BRIAN, letter G, and then Cronin is CRONIN.
All right. Well, if you want hanging on Google Hangout for like 1 minute after we wrap up. But other than that, thanks for tuning into this cast. Like I said, be sure to check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. But until then, folks, have a great evening. I'll see you guys later in a few minutes for that game stream, and I'm sure we'll talk again in the future.
All right, thanks for having me on.
All right, take care, Brian.
All right, bye.